To the strict moral courts of 19th century Europe, she was a woman drowning in scandal, a desperate prisoner of an unconsummated, medically impossible marriage, stripped of her dignity and forced to smuggle an illegitimate child into the freezing darkness of a silent convent. But to the desperate soldiers of a dying nation, she was a godsend, a fearless warrior queen, standing unyielding under the deafening roar of heavy artillery fire, risking her life to save a crumbling kingdom. She was Marie Sophie of Bavaria. How did a legendary icon of royal resilience become the architect of such an agonizing, desperate secret? Let us unravel the historical truth behind Marie Sophie, the affair, the pregnancy, and the German royal cover-up. Upon arriving at the Neapolitan court, the physical reality of her new life was an immediate, suffocating shock to 18-year-old Marie Sophie. Marie Sophie had been raised amidst the dark towering pines and icy sweeping lakes of Possenhofen, where the Wittelsbach children were allowed a degree of physical freedom completely alien to Southern European royalty. She was accustomed to the sharp alpine air and the exhausting thrill of riding horses for hours through unrestricted countryside. Naples, by contrast, felt like a heavily perfumed, velvet-lined vault. The royal palace of Naples and the vast, sprawling estate of Caserta were undeniably magnificent, dripping with the wealth of the Bourbon dynasty. But to Marie Sophie, the heavy draperies seemed designed to keep out the Mediterranean sun, and the air was thick with the scent of beeswax, incense, and ancient political decay. Behind the closed doors of the royal apartments, the facade of the grand dynastic alliance immediately collapsed into a grotesque private misery. The problem extended far beyond Crown Prince Francis's shyness. A fundamental biological catastrophe had been quietly ignored by the rigid, conservative court. Francis suffered from severe phimosis. In an era where surgical intervention for such a condition carried massive risks of infection and was considered deeply taboo, especially for a royal heir, the affliction had been left untreated. Every physical manifestation of arousal caused him excruciating, tearing pain. For a man raised in a brutally strict religious environment, this physical agony easily morphed into deep psychological terror. Francis had been educated by hardline Jesuits and heavily influenced by the legacy of his late mother, Maria Cristina of Savoy, a woman so pious she was known as the Holy Queen and later beatified. To Francis, the physical body was inherently sinful, a source of constant temptation, and, in his specific case, unendurable pain. To him, the marital bed resembled a torture chamber rather than a site of dynastic duty or affection. Marie Sophie, at 18, was in the absolute prime of her youth, possessing the vibrant, famous beauty of her family line. She was brought to Naples specifically to breed, to secure the Bourbon line against the looming threats to the kingdom. Instead, she found herself legally bound to a man who flinched at her approach. The humiliation of her situation was absolute and daily. The royal court was an ecosystem built entirely on observation and gossip. Hundreds of aristocrats, ladies-in-waiting, and servants watched the young couple incessantly, their eyes silently interrogating Marie Sophie's waistline for any sign of a pregnancy that would secure their political futures. They noted the separate sleeping arrangements, the distinct lack of physical ease between the newlyweds, and the heavy, grim atmosphere that hung over their private quarters. Marie Sophie knew they were whispering. She knew she was failing in her sole primary duty, yet she was utterly powerless to alter the reality of her husband's anatomy. Rather than confront his physical reality or seek medical help, Francis retreated into the only coping mechanism he understood: extreme, punishing religious devotion. If he could not be a husband, he would be a martyr to his faith, and he dragged his young wife into his ascetic misery. Night after night, the vibrant Bavarian princess was forced to kneel beside her husband on the cold marble floor of their bedroom. While the rest of the palace slept, Francis demanded they recite endless cycles of rosaries, litanies, and Latin prayers. The hours dragged on, draining Marie Sophie's physical energy and extinguishing her natural vitality. She was a young queen trapped in a state of enforced, humiliating celibacy. She paid for a sin she had not committed, anchored to a man paralyzed by his own flesh. This intense domestic suffocation was playing out against the backdrop of a rapidly deteriorating political landscape. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was the largest and wealthiest state on the Italian peninsula, but it was rotting from the inside. Francis's father, King Ferdinand II, known derisively as King Bomba for his ruthless shelling of his own rebellious cities, was dying a slow, agonizing death from a festering infection. As Ferdinand's health declined throughout the spring of 1859, the machinery of the state ground to a halt. Across the borders, the forces of the Risorgimento were gathering unstoppable momentum. The Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, guided by the brilliant and ruthless Prime Minister Camillo Cavour, was actively scheming to unify Italy under the House of Savoy. They had secured the backing of the French Empire and were systematically dismantling the old conservative order of the peninsula. Giuseppe Garibaldi, the charismatic revolutionary, was already planning his moves. In May 1859, King Ferdinand II finally succumbed to his illness. The death plunged the court into deep mourning, but for Marie Sophie, the implications were far more terrifying. The man kneeling beside her on the cold floor, the man who wept in terror at the thought of physical intimacy and deferred all decisions to his confessors, was now King Francis II. At 23 years old, Francis inherited absolute power over millions of subjects and a massive army, just as the kingdom faced the greatest existential threat in its history. He was entirely unequipped for the crown. He was indecisive, prone to fatalism, and deeply distrustful of his own ministers, many of whom were indeed corrupt or actively plotting treason with the Piedmontese. He viewed the growing rebellion not as a political crisis requiring military or diplomatic action, but as a divine punishment for the sins of his nation. Marie Sophie was now queen consort. The title offered her no comfort and no real authority, only a more prominent position on a sinking ship. She watched with mounting frustration as her husband fumbled every critical decision. When prominent generals advised him to take decisive military action to crush the early signs of rebellion in Sicily, Francis wavered, prayed, and ultimately did nothing, allowing the revolutionary spark to catch fire. When diplomats urged him to forge an alliance with Piedmont to save at least a portion of his kingdom, he refused out of a stubborn, rigid adherence to the divine right of kings. The suffocating atmosphere of the bedroom began to bleed into the affairs of state. The same paralyzing fear that kept Francis from his wife now kept him from defending his crown. Marie Sophie realized with cold clarity that there was no one to rely on. Her family in Bavaria was thousands of miles away, primarily concerned with their own political maneuvering. Her sister Elizabeth was navigating her own miseries in the stifling Austrian court. If the Bourbon dynasty of Naples was going to survive the coming storm, the strength would not come from the king. It would have to come from the frustrated, isolated, and rapidly hardening young woman standing beside him. As the year 1860 dawned, the rumors of Garibaldi's impending expedition grew from quiet whispers in the diplomatic back channels to open declarations of war. The 1,000 red shirts were gathering, preparing to cross the sea and strike at the heart of the southern kingdom. The Neapolitan court, sensing the shift in the wind, began to fracture. Aristocrats quietly packed their wealth. Generals calculated the price of their defection, and the once glittering palace took on the desperate, hollow atmosphere of a besieged fortress, long before the first shot was even fired. Marie Sophie stopped kneeling. The endless nights of prayer had yielded nothing but bruised knees and a crumbling empire. As the reality of the invasion materialized and the panic within the court reached a fever pitch, she shed the passive role that had been forced upon her since her arrival. The time for silent endurance was over. The enemy was marching on Naples, and the true test of her Wittelsbach blood was about to begin. The collapse of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the late summer of 1860 was not marked by a fierce, drawn-out military campaign, but by a humiliating, cascading series of defections. As Giuseppe Garibaldi and his red-shirted volunteers marched north from Calabria, the royal army simply melted away. Generals who had sworn absolute loyalty to the Bourbon crown a week prior were suddenly opening the gates to the revolutionaries. For Francis II, this betrayal confirmed his deepest, most fatalistic beliefs. The world was inherently corrupt, and God was actively punishing his dynasty. Rather than fortifying Naples and risking the destruction of the historic capital, he chose to abandon it. The evacuation was a chaotic, desperate affair. On the 6th of September, Marie Sophie and Francis boarded a steamship in the Bay of Naples, leaving behind the immense wealth, the art, and the suffocating comforts of the royal palaces. They sailed north to Gaeta, a massive, ancient coastal fortress built on a rocky promontory jutting into the Tyrrhenian Sea. It was the traditional last refuge of Neapolitan monarchs in times of crisis, a grim labyrinth of stone walls, artillery batteries, and dark, damp corridors. When the royal entourage arrived, Gaeta was not prepared to host a court. It was a functioning military installation, abruptly crammed with thousands of loyalist soldiers, terrified aristocrats, and a desperate royal family. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone, unwashed uniforms, and the ever-present tension of the impending siege. The Piedmontese army, commanded by General Enrico Cialdini, swiftly encircled the fortress from the landward side and brought up heavy siege artillery. The French fleet initially blocked a naval attack, giving Gaeta a temporary lifeline. But the noose was tightening. It was here, stripped of the velvet draperies and the rigid protocols of the Neapolitan court, that Marie Sophie underwent a profound transformation. The terrified, isolated teenager vanished, replaced by a woman of startling resilience and tactical awareness. While Francis spent his days locked in the fortress chapels, weeping before the altar and writing frantic, ignored letters to the other monarchs of Europe, Marie Sophie stepped directly into the line of fire. She abandoned the restrictive silk gowns of a queen consort for a practical ankle-length dark dress and a wide-brimmed Calabrian hat to shield her eyes from the sun and the dust. She did not remain safely in the deep subterranean vaults where the rest of the court huddled during the bombardments. Instead, she established a daily routine that terrified her handlers and electrified the garrison. As Cialdini's artillery pounded the ancient walls, turning stone to deadly shrapnel, Marie Sophie walked the ramparts. She visited the artillery batteries, standing entirely exposed alongside the gunners. When a shell landed close enough to shower them with debris, she did not flinch. She spoke to the men in her heavily accented Italian, distributing extra rations of food, cigars, and most importantly, her presence. For soldiers fighting a losing battle for a king they rarely saw, the sight of their 19-year-old queen standing calmly amidst the smoke and noise was profoundly motivating. She became the physical embodiment of their resistance. Her courage, however, was not limited to the adrenaline-fueled moments on the walls. The true horror of the siege of Gaeta unfolded in the makeshift hospitals. As the weeks dragged into months, the fortress became a breeding ground for disease. Typhus tore through the packed, unsanitary barracks, killing more men than the Piedmontese artillery. The medical facilities were catastrophically under-equipped to handle the influx of shattered limbs and raging fevers. Marie Sophie took personal charge of the hospitals. She walked through wards where the air was heavy with the smell of gangrene and death. In an era when royal women were shielded from anything even remotely unpleasant, she knelt beside dying soldiers, tearing her own linen petticoats to make bandages when supplies ran out. She assisted the overwhelmed surgeons, wiped the sweat from the faces of boys barely older than herself, and held their hands as they died. She witnessed the brutal, visceral reality of a body being destroyed, an ironic and grim contrast to her husband, who was terrified of the physical body's mere existence. The dynamic between the royal couple during the siege was deeply bizarre. They were sharing the intense trauma of a bombardment, facing the very real possibility of death at any moment. Yet the emotional and physical chasm between them remained as wide as ever. Francis admired her bravery, perhaps even relying on it to keep the army from mutinying, but he could not bridge the gap. His severe phimosis and his psychological blockages meant that even in the face of annihilation there was no comfort to be found in each other's arms. They were comrades in a lost cause, but they were still not husband and wife. The turning point came in early February 1861. The French fleet, under intense diplomatic pressure, withdrew, leaving Gaeta entirely blockaded by sea. Shortly after, a Piedmontese shell struck the main powder magazine of the fortress. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, tearing a massive hole in the defenses and killing hundreds of soldiers and civilians instantly. The shock wave shattered the windows of the royal quarters. The situation was now mathematically impossible. The defenses were breached, the garrison was starving and riddled with typhus, and the ammunition was nearly gone. Francis, finally accepting the reality of the situation, agreed to terms of surrender. On the 14th of February, the royal couple walked out of the fortress. The defending soldiers, many openly weeping, presented arms as Marie Sophie passed. They boarded a French ship, the Mouette, to the sound of a final, respectful salute from the very Piedmontese artillery that had spent months trying to kill them. As the coastline of her lost kingdom faded into the distance, Marie Sophie stood on the deck, a queen without a country, having earned a fierce, blood-soaked respect that her husband never could. Their destination was Rome. Pope Pius IX, sympathetic to the plight of the deposed Catholic monarchs, offered them sanctuary. They were installed in the Quirinal Palace, an imposing, drafty residence that felt less like a home and more like an opulent waiting room. The transition from the deafening, purposeful chaos of Gaeta to the stagnant, whispering atmosphere of the Roman court was psychologically devastating for Marie Sophie. During the siege, she had been essential. She had a mission, a daily routine of survival that kept her mind occupied and her adrenaline surging. She was the Heroine of Gaeta, celebrated in the conservative press across Europe as a symbol of royal defiance. In Rome, she was abruptly reduced back to her previous status, a decorative appendage to an impotent king. The court in exile was a toxic environment filled with former Neapolitan ministers and displaced aristocrats who spent their days spinning delusional plots to retake the kingdom, blaming each other for the defeat and scrutinizing the royal couple's every move. Francis sank further into his depression. Without even a kingdom to govern badly, his days were entirely consumed by religious observance and drafting feudal protests to foreign governments. He retreated into a small circle of reactionary clerics, leaving Marie Sophie to navigate the complex social waters of Rome alone. The physical reality of her marriage remained a silent, crushing weight. She was 20 years old, physically robust, and celebrated for her beauty. The fires of the siege had proven her immense vitality and her capacity for action. Yet she was expected to live the life of a cloistered nun, permanently chained to a man whose physical condition made him recoil from her touch. The enforced celibacy, the lack of any meaningful occupation, and the claustrophobic gossip of the exiled court began to erode the iron discipline she had maintained at Gaeta. Rome in the early 1860s was a city living on borrowed time. The Papal States were the last chunk of the Italian peninsula resisting unification, protected only by a garrison of French troops and a volunteer army of international Catholic noblemen known as the Papal Zouaves. This military presence gave the city a restless, masculine energy. The streets and salons were filled with dashing, idealistic young officers from France, Belgium, and Ireland, men who had come to fight for the Pope, but were highly susceptible to the charms of the Roman social scene. It was an environment engineered for disaster. Marie Sophie, bursting with suppressed energy and starved of any genuine affection or physical validation, was thrust into endless receptions and riding parties populated by exactly the sort of men her husband was not. Her motivations had entirely shifted. She battled for her own sanity, desperate for anything that would make her feel alive again after the death of her kingdom and the ongoing death of her marriage. She was a volatile spark surrounded by dry powder, and it was only a matter of time before she found a reason to ignite it. The catalyst for the inevitable disaster was a young Belgian nobleman named Armand de Laues. He was an officer in the Papal Zouaves, the elite international military unit formed specifically to defend the temporal power of the Pope against the encroaching forces of Italian unification. The Zouaves were a unique breed of men in 1860s Rome. They were fiercely Catholic, generally aristocratic, and heavily romanticized. They wore striking quasi-Eastern uniforms and carried themselves with the swagger of crusaders fighting a holy war. Armand was, in every conceivable metric, the absolute inverse of Francis II. He was physically robust, decisively active, and entirely unburdened by the crippling psychological and physical neuroses that paralyzed the exiled king of Naples. Their paths crossed in the claustrophobic, intensely scrutinized social circles of the Roman aristocracy. For Marie Sophie, still riding the psychological high of her military command at Gaeta, but violently thrust back into domestic irrelevance, the attraction was immediate and profound. She was 21 years old, legally bound to an impotent ascetic and suffocating under the weight of an empty title. Armand offered not just physical validation, but a glimpse of the vital, passionate existence she had been completely denied. This affair transcended a simple breach of marital vows. In the context of 19th century royalty, it constituted an act of high treason. The political architecture of Europe relied heavily on the absolute certainty of legitimate bloodlines. An adulteress queen introduced a lethal variable into this system. If the affair were discovered, it would not just destroy her own reputation. It would severely damage the diplomatic standing of the Papal States that hosted her, humiliate the exiled Bourbon dynasty, and cast a long, dark shadow over her own Wittelsbach family, whose most prominent member, her sister Elizabeth, sat on the imperial throne in Vienna. The stakes were astronomical, yet the psychological starvation she had endured made the risk acceptable. They met in absolute secrecy, utilizing the sprawling labyrinthine gardens of Roman villas and the discreet cooperation of a handful of heavily bribed or fiercely loyal confidants. For a few months, the affair provided the illusion of an escape. But by the late autumn of 1862, the biological reality of her rebellion materialized, turning the illicit romance into a waking nightmare. Marie Sophie realized she was pregnant. The sheer terror of this discovery cannot be overstated. There was no room for ambiguity, no possibility of passing the child off as the king's. Francis's severe phimosis and their entirely unconsummated marriage were facts known intimately by the royal physicians and widely suspected by the court. If her expanding waistline were noticed in Rome, the scandal would detonate across the continent. She would be utterly ruined, likely stripped of her titles, permanently separated from the aristocratic world, and locked away in disgrace. The Heroine of Gaeta, the defiant symbol of conservative Europe, would become its most spectacular cautionary tale. She could not remain in the Quirinal Palace. The daily scrutiny of the ladies-in-waiting, the fitted silk dresses of the era, and the sheer volume of gossip in Rome made concealment impossible. She required an immediate, impenetrable alibi and a safe harbor. There was only one entity power, fuel enough and ruthless enough to orchestrate the necessary deception: her own family. In November 1862, under the pretext of requiring a change of climate for her nerves following the trauma of the siege, Marie Sophie hastily departed Rome and crossed the Alps back into Bavaria. She bypassed the grand royal courts and headed straight for her mother, Duchess Ludovica. If Marie Sophie was seeking maternal comfort, she was severely disappointed. The Wittelsbachs were a political dynasty first and a family second. When Ludovica was presented with her daughter's heavily pregnant state, maternal empathy was entirely absent. Instead, the Duchess initiated cold, terrifyingly efficient crisis management. Ludovica recognized instantly that this was a threat not just to Marie Sophie, but to the entire fabric of Wittelsbach alliances. A bastard child born to the Queen of Naples would give the family's enemies unlimited ammunition. It had to be erased. The matriarch convened a highly secretive council with a select few members of the family, most notably Marie Sophie's brothers. Together, they constructed a massive airtight medical lie. They decided to weaponize the most prevalent and feared medical condition of the era, tuberculosis. In the mid-19th century, consumption was poorly understood but universally dreaded. It was known to be deadly, and the only accepted medical treatment was prolonged absolute isolation in a clean, quiet environment, far away from the stresses of public life. It was the perfect, unassailable cover story. The Bavarian ducal court issued somber, official bulletins to the capitals of Europe, including to Francis in Rome and Elizabeth in Vienna. The official narrative stated that the Queen of Naples had contracted a severe, highly concerning pulmonary illness. She was weak, she was infectious, and she required immediate sequestration. To sell the lie, Marie Sophie had to perform the role of a dying woman. The natural physical toll of an incredibly stressful hidden pregnancy aided the deception. She was pale, exhausted, and visibly anxious. The family immediately moved her away from the busy center of Munich to the remote, heavily walled Ursuline convent in the city of Augsburg. The contrast between her previous life and the reality of Augsburg was violently jarring. Just over a year prior, she had been standing on the artillery batteries of Gaeta, commanding the respect of an entire army, her face printed on broadsheets across Europe as a symbol of defiance. Now, she was smuggled into a cold, silent religious institution through a side door, stripped of her royal retinue, and hidden away like a criminal. The Ursuline nuns were brought into the conspiracy under strict orders from the highest levels of the Bavarian state and church. They were sworn to absolute, unbreakable silence. Within the thick stone walls of the convent, Marie Sophie was confined to a small suite of rooms. The grand, sweeping vistas of the Bay of Naples and the bustling streets of Rome were replaced by a view of an enclosed courtyard. Her days, once filled with the intense life-or-death decisions of a siege or the dangerous thrill of her affair with Armand, were now reduced to the agonizing, slow ticking of a clock as she waited for her body to betray her. She was entirely alone. Armand de Lois had been left behind in Rome, entirely ignorant of the crisis he had initiated, protected by the very silence that was suffocating her. Her husband believed she was slowly dying of lung disease. Her mother and siblings viewed her not as a pregnant woman in need of care, but as a severe liability requiring the management. As the winter of 1862 descended on Bavaria, blanketing the convent in deep snow, the physical discomfort of the advanced pregnancy was eclipsed by the psychological dread of what was to come. She knew the child she carried, the only tangible proof of the only genuine affection she had experienced in her adult life, would never truly be hers. The Wittelsbach machine was already making arrangements for the extraction. The physical realities of a Bavarian winter in 1862 were brutal, but inside the Ursuline convent in Augsburg, the cold was as much psychological as it was atmospheric. Marie Sophie's confinement was nearing its end. The massive stone walls that surrounded the religious complex acted as a fortress against the prying eyes of the European press, the political spies of a unifying Italy, and the gossip of her own extended family. She was entirely isolated, attended only by a closely vetted circle of nuns and the most trusted, tight-lipped medical personnel her mother Duchess Ludovica could procure. When the labor finally began, it was a profound exercise in suppression. A royal birth was traditionally a highly public event, witnessed by ministers of state and courtiers to verify the legitimacy of the heir. This birth, however, required absolute terrifying silence. The existence of the child was a death warrant to the political standing of the Wittelsbachs and the Bourbons. In the early hours of a freezing morning, without the comforts of her royal station and stripped of any familial warmth, Marie Sophie gave birth to a daughter. There was no time permitted for maternal bonding, no quiet moments of recovery. The machinery of the Wittelsbach dynasty, directed with ruthless efficiency by Ludovica, immediately engaged. The infant was swaddled, but not for her mother's arms. The prior arrangements made with the family of Armand de Lois were instantly executed. The child was handed over to a designated proxy, destined to be raised by the Belgian nobleman's relatives under a thick, unbreakable veil of sworn secrecy. The girl would be named Mathilde Marie, though her mother would never be allowed to call her that. The physical separation was absolute and instantaneous. Marie Sophie watched the infant being carried out of the convent room. In that moment, she knew with agonizing certainty that she was witnessing the complete erasure of her own flesh and blood. She had surrendered her youth to an impotent king. She had risked her life on the artillery batteries of Gaeta. And now she was forced to amputate the only tangible consequence of her brief, desperate grasp at a genuine human connection. The transaction was finalized. The royal honor was preserved, paid for entirely by a mother's permanent, silent grief. With the child gone, the second phase of the Great Deception had to be swiftly implemented. The official narrative, carefully seeded across the courts of Europe months prior, dictated that the Queen of Naples had been fighting a desperate battle against tuberculosis. Now, the Bavarian medical establishment issued highly coordinated bulletins declaring a miraculous, though fragile, recovery. The pure alpine air and the absolute rest, they claimed, had cleared her lungs. The physical exhaustion, the pallor, and the obvious trauma visible on Marie Sophie's face were easily explained away to the public as the lingering after effects of a deadly pulmonary disease. By the spring of 1863, the family determined she was physically recovered enough to travel. She was packed into a carriage, entirely empty-handed, and sent back across the Alps. The journey back to Rome was a procession of mounting dread. She was returning to the Quirinal Palace, returning to the claustrophobic circles of exiled aristocrats, and returning to Francis. When she arrived in Rome, the exiled king received her with genuine relief. Francis believed the lie completely. He believed he had nearly lost his wife to consumption, entirely ignorant of the fact that the woman standing before him was mourning a daughter he did not know existed. The psychological burden placed upon Marie Sophie at this moment was almost incomprehensible. She was forced to resume the role of the devoted, chaste wife, smiling through receptions and attending endless masses, while the physical memory of the earth and the crushing guilt of the secret festered just beneath the surface. Furthermore, Rome still held Armand de Lois. The sheer terrifying risk of encountering the father of her exiled child in the salons or on the riding trails of the city forced her to maintain an exhausting, permanent state of hypervigilance. This life of absolute compartmentalization was unsustainable. The internal pressure of the secret, combined with the daily suffocating reality of her unconsummated marriage, began to break her formidable resolve. The timeline remains deliberately obscured by royal archivists, But at some point following her return to Rome, the silence finally shattered. Unable to carry the deception any longer, Marie Sophie walked into her husband's private quarters and confessed. She admitted to the affair with the Zouave officer. She admitted to the pregnancy, and she admitted to the birth and subsequent exile of the illegitimate child in Augsburg. In the rigid, unforgiving world of 19th century royalty, a confession of this magnitude should have triggered an immediate, catastrophic retaliation. Francis had the legal and moral authority to have her imprisoned, stripped of her titles, and publicly disgraced. The Bourbon dynasty, already humiliated by the loss of its kingdom, could have demanded severe retribution against the Wittelsbachs for the severe contamination of their bloodline. Instead, Francis's reaction defied every political and social expectation. He did not explode into a rage. He did not summon his ministers. He listened to the absolute destruction of his marital honor, and he forgave her. This forgiveness was not born of weakness, but of a profound, twisted realization of his own complicity. Francis's religious fanaticism, which had for years manifested as a punishing asceticism, now pivoted toward a radical, almost Christ-like grace. He knew with absolute certainty that his severe phimosis and his resulting inability to act as a husband had driven his vibrant, desperate wife into the arms of another man. He recognized that while she had committed the physical sin of adultery, he had created the intolerable vacuum that made it inevitable. They were both victims of a system that demanded they perform roles they were biologically and psychologically incapable of fulfilling. In the ruins of their shared failures, a strange, tragic solidarity was finally forged. The confession and the subsequent forgiveness acted as a brutal catalyst. The air was cleared, but the fundamental problem remained. If they were to survive this, if they were to actually be a married couple, the physical barrier between them had to be eliminated. Spurred by the trauma of the near destruction of his marriage, Francis finally agreed to do what he should have done a decade earlier. He submitted to surgical intervention. In the mid-1860s, surgery was an incredibly dangerous proposition. The concepts of antisepsis were barely in their infancy, and anesthesia, while available in the form of ether or chloroform, was risky and difficult to dose correctly. For a deposed monarch to undergo a highly sensitive, painful operation on his genitalia in an exile court was an act of extreme desperation. The surgeons were brought in discreetly. The procedure to correct the severe phimosis was performed, subjecting Francis to intense physical pain and a terrifying period of recovery where the risk of fatal infection loomed over the Quirinal palace. The surgery, against considerable odds, was a success. The physical deformity that had defined and poisoned their relationship since their wedding night in Naples was removed. Nearly 10 years after they had stood at the altar, long after they had lost their kingdom, survived a brutal military siege, and navigated a catastrophic, secret pregnancy, Francis and Marie Sophie finally consummated their marriage. The dynamics of their relationship fundamentally shifted. They were no longer a terrified ascetic and an isolated prisoner. They were two deeply damaged survivors trying to salvage a normal human existence from the wreckage of their dynastic duties. In 1869, the impossible happened. The European courts, which had long since written off the king and Queen of Naples as a tragic, barren footnote of history, were stunned by an official announcement from Rome. Marie Sophie was pregnant again, and this time there was no need for frantic journeys to Bavaria or fabricated medical bulletins. On Christmas Eve of 1869, in the Quirinal Palace, Marie Sophie gave birth to a daughter. She was named Maria Christina Pia, after Francis's beatified mother and the Pope who had given them sanctuary. For the first time in her life, Marie Sophie was allowed to hold her own child openly. She was allowed to experience the unfiltered, unhidden joy of motherhood. Francis, the man who had spent his life terrified of the physical world, was completely captivated by his legitimate heir. For a few brief months, the exiled Bourbon court in Rome experienced a period of genuine, conventional happiness. The curse of their early years seemed to have finally been broken by the sheer force of their endurance. But the reprieve was a cruel illusion. The fragility of human life in the 19th century cared nothing for the suffering they had already endured to bring the child into the world. In the early spring of 1870, when Maria Christina was barely 3 months old, she contracted a severe fever. The finest physicians in Rome were summoned, but their poultices and bleedings were useless against the infection. Within days, the long-awaited legitimate heir, the child meant to redeem a decade of misery, died in her parents' arms. The death of Maria Christina was the final devastating blow. It permanently extinguished any remaining hope for the continuation of their line. Marie Sophie had now given birth to 2 children. One she was forced to abandon to strangers in the freezing snow of Bavaria, and one she was forced to bury in the crypts of Rome. The universe, it seemed, was entirely indifferent to their attempts at redemption. They were left, once again, with nothing but each other, facing a rapidly modernizing world that was preparing to sweep away the last remnants of the society that had created them. The death of the infant Maria Christina in the spring of 1870 did not simply return the royal couple to their previous state of melancholy. It fractured the very foundation of their hard-won reconciliation. For Francis, the loss of his legitimate heir was interpreted through the only lens he possessed: severe, uncompromising religious fatalism. He viewed the child's death as a definitive divine judgment against his bloodline, a punishment for the sins of his dynasty and perhaps for the moral compromises of his marriage. He withdrew further into the darkened chapels of the Quirinal Palace, seeking comfort in an asceticism that alienated everyone around him. For Marie Sophie, the grief manifested as a cold, impenetrable hardening of her character. She had surrendered her youth to political duty. She had sacrificed her firstborn illegitimate daughter to preserve the family honor, and she had endured a dangerous, humiliating physical reconciliation with her husband to secure their future. The universe had responded by taking the one pure, untainted source of joy she had managed to produce. She stopped crying. She stopped seeking conventional happiness. The vibrant, fiercely hopeful girl who had stood on the artillery batteries of Gaeta was permanently replaced by a stoic, emotionally armored woman who viewed the world with a profound, bitter clarity. There was no time to mourn in peace. The personal tragedy was immediately eclipsed by a massive, final geopolitical collapse. In the summer of 1870, the political landscape of Europe shifted violently. The Franco-Prussian War erupted, and Emperor Napoleon III was forced to withdraw the French military garrison that had been protecting the Papal States. Rome, the last remaining stronghold against Italian unification, was suddenly left entirely defenseless. In September, the Piedmontese army, the same forces that had bombarded Gaeta a decade earlier, surrounded the Eternal City. There was no heroic final stand. After a brief artillery barrage that breached the ancient Aurelian walls at the Porta Pia, Pope Pius IX ordered his forces to surrender to prevent a massacre. The Italian tricolor was raised over Rome. The House of Savoy had finally conquered the entire peninsula. For the exiled King and Queen of Naples, it was a profound humiliation. They were no longer guests of a sovereign pontiff. They were now unwanted remnants of a dead era residing in the capital of their conquerors. They were forced to pack up their remaining possessions, their salvaged artwork, and their diminished court and flee once again. This time, there were no grand European powers offering them sanctuary. They boarded a train heading north, watching the Italian landscape, the kingdom that was supposed to be their inheritance, disappear behind them. They were truly, completely stateless. They eventually settled in Paris, purchasing a large mansion on the elegant Avenue de l'Impératrice. Paris during the Belle Époque was a city rapidly modernizing, a bustling metropolis of new wealth, grand boulevards, and shifting social classes. In this vibrant environment, the exiled Bourbon court appeared as a bizarre, melancholic anachronism. The dynamic between Francis and Marie Sophie settled into a quiet, heavily formalized routine. They lived in the same house but occupied entirely different worlds. Francis, stripped of his crown and his country, essentially gave up on the physical world. He spent his days visiting obscure Parisian churches, praying for hours on end, and giving away what remained of his personal fortune to beggars and exiled Neapolitan soldiers. He dressed shabbily, ate sparingly, and faded into a ghost of a man, waiting patiently for a death he believed would finally bring him peace. Marie Sophie conversely refused to fade away. She channeled her immense frustrated energy into an aggressively independent lifestyle. She became a fixture in the Bois de Boulogne, riding her horses with a reckless, punishing intensity. Dressed in severe dark riding habits, she presented a striking, intimidating figure. She attended the opera and high society salons, not to engage in the frivolous gossip of the Parisian elite, but to assert her continued existence. She maintained a sharp, unforgiving wit and a commanding presence that kept pity at bay. She was a queen without a throne, but she demanded the respect owed to her bloodline and her survival. Yet the ghosts of her past refused to leave her in peace. The secret she carried, the illegitimate daughter abandoned in the Bavarian convent, remained a silent, bleeding wound. She had no way to contact the child, no way to know if Matilda Marie was healthy, happy, or even aware of her true parentage. The absolute cruelty of the Wittelsbach deception meant that Marie Sophie was forced to watch other mothers in the parks of Paris with a quiet, devastating envy. She had paid the highest possible price for her family's reputation, and the silence surrounding the transaction only made it more agonizing. As the 1870s bled into the 1880s, the psychological toll of the Wittelsbach curse began to ravage her extended family in a highly public, spectacular fashion. The resilience that Marie Sophie had developed was continually tested by the horrific news arriving from the courts of Munich and Vienna. Her cousin, King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the eccentric builder of fairy tale castles, descended into severe mental illness. He was deposed by the Bavarian government, and mere days later was found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg under highly suspicious circumstances. The dynasty that had ruthlessly orchestrated Marie Sophie's life was crumbling. Under the weight of its own genetic and psychological instability, the darkness extended to her sister Empress Elizabeth. Sisi, entirely consumed by her own despair and the suffocating rigidity of the Austrian court, had essentially abandoned her imperial duties. She wandered Europe like a glamorous anorexic phantom, obsessed with her fading beauty and deeply detached from reality. The ultimate blow struck in 1889 when Sisi's only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, killed his teenage mistress and then himself in the hunting lodge at Merling. The suicide of the heir to the Habsburg Empire sent shockwaves through the world, but for Marie Sophie, it was simply another confirmation of the relentless tragedy that stalked her bloodline. Watching her family implode from a distance, Marie Sophie's relationship with Francis underwent a final, profound evolution. The bitter resentment of their early marriage, the furious rebellion of her affair, and the crushing grief of their child's death eventually burned themselves out, leaving behind a strange, quiet companionship. They had spent over 30 years together, tied together by failure and exile. They were the only two people on earth who truly understood the exact dimensions of the other's suffering. When Francis's health began to seriously fail in the early 1890s, the severe, independent Queen of Naples transformed into his dedicated, fiercely protective nurse. He suffered immensely from complications related to diabetes, his body wasting away just as his kingdom had. They moved to the quiet Austrian spa town of Arco in the Trentino Mountains, seeking relief in the pure alpine air. There, far from the glittering, indifferent streets of Paris and the treacherous politics of Rome, Francis II entered his final decline. Marie Sophie rarely left his side. The man she had once despised for his weakness now relied on her completely, and in caring for him she found a somber, grounding purpose. There were no grand declarations of romantic love in those final months, only the deep, unspoken solidarity of two survivors facing the end of their shared ordeal. On December 27th, 1894, Francis II, the last king of the two Sicilies, died quietly in his bed, murmuring prayers for the soul of his lost kingdom. He was 58 years old. Marie Sophie was now a widow. At 53, she had outlived her crown, her homeland, both of the children she had birthed, and the husband who had been the source of both her greatest miseries and her only permanent companionship. The rigid aristocratic structures that had dictated every brutal sacrifice of her life were beginning to crack, but she was trapped within them, a solitary monument to a dead era. As she stood beside the body of the man she had been forced to marry 3 decades earlier, she prepared to enter the final, most isolating chapter of her life, entirely alone. The immediate logistics of death for an exiled monarch presented a bitter, final humiliation. When Francis II died in the winter of 1894, he was a king entirely devoid of a kingdom. There was no grand state funeral in Naples, no procession through the streets he had once ruled, and no royal crypt waiting to receive his body. The Bourbon dynasty, which had spent centuries building massive monuments to its own permanence, was reduced to negotiating for a temporary resting place in a foreign land. Marie Sophie arranged for her husband to be buried in Arco, the quiet Austrian town where he had drawn his last breath. He was placed in a borrowed tomb, a transient resident even in death. With Francis gone, the heavy, defining anchor of Marie Sophie's adult life was removed. She was 53 years old, possessing a considerable personal fortune, salvaged from the wreckage of their kingdom. And for the first time since she was 18, she was entirely free from the immediate daily requirements of another human being. She returned to Paris, taking up residence in Neuilly-sur-Seine, in the sprawling, wealthy capital of the French Third Republic. She cut an imposing, solitary figure. She dressed almost exclusively in black, a permanent mourning that served as both a tribute to her lost family and an impenetrable armor against a society that had long since moved on from the political crises of her youth. But the 19th century was not finished extracting its toll from the Wittelsbach women. The curse of her family line, characterized by profound psychological distress and violent ends, struck again with a sudden, senseless brutality. In September 1898, Marie Sophie received the news that her older sister, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, had been assassinated in Geneva. Sisi, who had spent decades running from the suffocating duties of the Habsburg court, wandering Europe under assumed names and hiding her famously beautiful face behind dark veils, was attacked on a public promenade. An Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini, seeking to kill any aristocrat to make a political statement, drove a sharpened industrial file into her heart. Sisi bled to death in her hotel room shortly after. For Marie Sophie, the murder of her sister was a catastrophic psychological blow. It was not simply the loss of a sibling. It was the violent collision of her past with a terrifying new political reality. The world was no longer simply a chessboard where kings and queens moved armies to settle dynastic disputes. A new chaotic era had arrived, driven by anarchism and popular rage, where royalty were hunted not for their political power, but simply for the symbolism of their blood. The assassination of the Empress of Austria demonstrated with absolute clarity that the protective aura of the crown had vanished entirely. This realization fueled a complex, often debated chapter in Marie Sophie's later years. The historical record surrounding her activities at the turn of the century is murky, heavily colored by the paranoia of the era and the intense hostility of the Italian government. In Rome, the newly established Savoy monarchy viewed the surviving Bourbon queen as a legitimate, ongoing threat. Rumors and intelligence reports began to circulate through European diplomatic channels, suggesting that Marie Sophie was not merely a grieving widow, but an active, vengeful political operator. She was accused of quietly funding underground anarchist networks and subversives within Italy. The theory posited that the Queen of Naples, stripped of her army and her territory, was using her personal wealth to destabilize the very government that had stolen her crown. When King Umberto I of Italy, the son of the man who had ordered the bombardment of Gaeta, was assassinated by an anarchist in 1900, segments of the Italian press pointed the finger directly at the dark mansion in Neuilly-sur-Seine. Whether she actively funded these plots remains a point of intense historical debate. There is no definitive paper trail linking her fortune to the assassin's revolver. However, her deep, unyielding hatred for the House of Savoy was a matter of public record. She never recognized the legitimacy of the unified Italian state. She viewed them as usurpers and thieves. It is entirely plausible that she offered financial support to political exiles and anti-Savoy factions, operating under the ruthless logic that the enemy of her enemy was a necessary tool. The heroine of Gaeta had not lost her militant edge. She had simply been forced to change her tactics from artillery fire to covert disruption. Amidst these political shadows, the deepest, most private wound of her life finally reached its tragic conclusion. The daughter born in the freezing secrecy of the Augsburg convent, Mathilde Marie, grew up entirely disconnected from her royal heritage. Raised by the Delaways family, the girl lived a quiet, obscure life, shadowed by the massive, silent deception of her origins. The exact details of the girl's life are fiercely guarded by the surviving archival walls erected by the wit, Telsbox, but the historical consensus points to a bleak, devastating finality. Many historians believe the daughter died as a young woman, succumbing to illness before reaching full maturity. Accounts suggest there was no dramatic deathbed reunion. There was no final moment of maternal acknowledgement. Marie Sophie received the news from a distance, barred from attending the funeral of her own child, just as she had been barred from holding her after birth. The sheer futility of this sacrifice is the darkest element of Marie Sophie's story. She had surrendered her daughter to protect the absolute moral authority and political stability of the Wittelsbach and Bourbon dynasties. Yet, she lived long enough to watch both of those dynasties completely collapse. The secret was kept, the family honor was preserved, and it ultimately did not matter in the slightest. The forces of history swept them away regardless. She had traded her child for a political illusion that shattered in her own lifetime. When the First World War erupted in 1914, it functioned as the final executioner of the world that had created Marie Sophie. The conflict pitted her homeland of Germany and her sister's Austrian Empire against her former host nation of France and the Italian state she despised. Living in Paris at the outbreak of hostilities, she found her position immediately precarious. She was a German-born aristocrat in the capital of a nation at war with Germany. Refusing to be treated as an enemy alien or forced into internment, she packed her remaining household and moved back to Munich. Returning to Bavaria in her 70s, she arrived in a nation actively destroying itself in the trenches of Europe. Her behavior during the Great War was characteristically defiant. She did not retreat into a country estate. She actively worked in the prisoner of war camps around Munich, specifically seeking out captured Italian and French soldiers. To the German authorities, this was highly suspicious. To the French and Italians, it was baffling. But Marie Sophie was operating on a code of conduct that predated the modern concepts of nationalism. She spoke to the Italian prisoners in the Neapolitan dialect she had learned a lifetime ago. She brought them food and medical supplies. She was not a German patriot nor an Italian traitor. She was the Queen of Naples, dispensing charity to the soldiers who had once been her subjects or who fought for the countries that had once offered her shelter. She belonged to a supranational aristocracy that was currently bleeding to death on the battlefields of the Somme and Verdun. In November 1918, the final pillar fell. The German Empire surrendered, and the domestic revolutions that followed swept the continent. In Munich, the Wittelsbach dynasty, which had ruled Bavaria for over 700 years, was formally deposed. The royal palaces were seized, the titles were abolished, and a fragile republic was declared. A few days later, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, erasing the Habsburgs from power. Marie Sophie survived it all. She watched the emperors and kings of her generation flee into exile, abdicating their thrones in terror. She had done her fleeing 50 years earlier. She spent her final years in Munich during the chaotic, hyperinflated early days of the Weimar Republic. She was a relic, an ancient woman walking the streets of a modern, traumatized city. She was often seen riding a horse in the Englischer Garden, a severe, unbending figure dressed in black, her posture perfectly straight despite her advancing age. She rarely spoke to the press, she offered no memoirs, and she asked for no apologies from the history that had brutalized her. Marie Sophie died of severe pneumonia on January 19, 1925, in Munich, the city of her birth. She was 83 years old, having outlived the kingdom of the Two Sicilies by 64 years. She survived the husband who had feared her, The lover who had compromised her, the children who had been taken from her, and the entire political framework of monarchical Europe that demanded her absolute sacrifice. Her life was an extraordinary testament to human endurance, a terrifying example of familial cruelty, and a profound demonstration of the absolute indifferent violence of historical change. Yet the world that had once celebrated the heroine of Gaeta met her passing with profound silence. For decades, she rested in the grim crypts of her Bavarian ancestors, an obscure footnote in the catastrophic history of early 20th century Europe. It wasn't until 1984 that history offered a quiet resolution. The bodies of King Francis II, Queen Marie Sophie, and their infant daughter Maria Cristina were finally exhumed and returned to the Basilica of Santa Chiara in Naples. There, bathed in Mediterranean light, she achieved in death what she had fought so fiercely to secure in life, a permanent, recognized place in the heart of her kingdom. Her life exposes the heavy toll extracted by the 19th century aristocracy. Yet, she did not break. Marie Sophie remains a solitary, unbreakable testament to a human spirit that outlasted the very empires that tried to crush it.